I would rather not have to use tariffs, Donald Trump said last week in an interview with Fox News. He echoed a similar sentiment at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, where he stated that China and the United States, quote unquote, are going to have a very good relationship. Since taking office on January the 20th, President Trump has adopted a rather nuanced approach on China tariffs, a contrast to his hardline trade policy during his first presidency. However, the end of honeymoon period still looms as the tariff man campaigned on levying high tariffs on all Chinese imports to the United States. Furthermore, the country's lawmakers introduced a bipartisan bill that will see China's preferential trade status, which was granted in 2000 ahead of China's accession to the World Trade Organization, revoked. Now, can both sides find ways to establish a mutually beneficial trade relationship? Why has trade been resilient despite President Trump's tariffs that were kept in place by President Biden? And can new and bigger tariffs really make America great again? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. I'm pleased to be joined from Shanghai by Professor Zhang Gong, Vice President of the University of International Business and Economics, Israel. From Portland, Oregon, the United States, Professor Liang Yan, Kremer Chair Professor of Economics at Willamette University, and from Oslo, Norway at 4:30 in the morning, Carl Fei, Professor of Strategy at BI Norwegian Business School. The warmest welcome to all of you. And on this very last live episode of The Point with me, Li Xin, coming to you from Beijing. As you can see, I have a snake on my shirt. That's the sign of the day. But anyway, let's talk about one big question. You know, I wanted to talk about the resilience of bilateral trade, but I want to ask Professor Gong this question. If Trump's trade war hurted, the U.S. consumers, why did the U.S. voters still voted him in place?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. Happy New Year. The question about why President Trump is elected, I think American voters don't have a very good idea about the relationship between tariff and the price. He's basically elected for two reasons. One, of course, his promise to contain prices, beat inflation. The Biden administration didn't do a very good job of doing that. The second, of course, is the border control and illegal immigration issue. American people are really fed up with that. The promise that it's not going to have a major impact on inflation, but at the same time, he's going to impose tariffs on foreign imports, saving American jobs, stuff like that. They sound very interesting and also very attractive to American voters. But the real impact, we as economists, China as economists, know very well that a lot of American imports actually have fairly low demand elasticity, which means that eventually the buyer side, demand
All
side
right.
is going to pay for these tariffs. So I think the impact of increased price on goods that American house going to buy is very much inevitable in my view.
Professor Liang, what is your viewpoint there? I mean, okay, it may have been the U.S. consumers, MAGA people, or Democrat supporters alike. It may have been them who had paid up for the tariffs, but if they continued, especially the MAGA people, if they voted Trump back into office, it probably meant that they were fine with the higher prices that they were paying, whether they thought it was inflation introduced by President Biden or it was the legacy of tariffs introduced by Trump.
Well, I think that's a great question. I think for one, objectively, back in Trump 1.0, the inflation rate was much lower. 2017-18 inflation rate was like 2.4%, 1.7%. And that was due to largely, the global sort of supply chain that have been very resilient. And even with the tariff, I think China's depreciation of the currency against the dollar still allowed American households to buy the Chinese products at a relatively cheap price. And also a lot of these consumer goods were actually exempt from the Trump's tariff. Most of the tariffs were on intermediate goods and also capital goods. So in some ways, American households did not have a huge impact during that time. But I think times are different. United States just came out from a 9.1% of a peak of inflation back in 2021, and that memory is still very fresh on the American consumers. Not to mention, even now we have disinflation, so inflation increased by a slower rate. The price is still higher, much higher, than 8 years ago. So I think a little bit increase in the price will be felt by the consumers. So I think this time around, Trump needs to be more cautious when it comes to imposing tariffs. And I think that is the reason that we're not seeing that 60% across the board tariff is being imposed on the first day of his presidency. And he has to really think more strategically this time around.
Professor Fay, unless you have something extraordinarily different to say, then let's move on to the next question. Because I want to talk about the resilience of U.S.-China trade, trading goods, especially over the past 5 years. Trump wanted to deter trade. He said the trade was not fair, so he, was pretty much beating up trade with China. And it turned out, let's take a look at this chart here. It turns out that U.S.-China bilateral trading goods actually over the past 5 years, from year 2018 to the year 2024, pretty much resilient and very stable. That dotted line there is when President Biden came into office. We see there was a decrease in the year 2019 and 2023, but other than that, the general trend is still going up from $633 billion in 2018 to $688 billion in 2024. These are official numbers from China. Carl, how do you look at the steadiness of bilateral trade in general?
Well, I think the key thing this shows is that there's a really strong interdependence between China and the U.S., and that's hard to move away from. We indeed have had growing trade, more or less, despite these tariffs. But as the previous speaker mentioned, indeed, these tariffs were not across the board. They were targeted tariffs. And I think across the board tariffs would really make a big difference. And in fact, there have been some studies that have been trying to suggest what might happen if one did have some tariffs put in place. And looking at a variety of different scenarios, it's been suggested that maybe you would have the U.S. GDP going up between 1.7 and 3.4%, and you would have employment decrease by between 0.5 and 0.9%, and you would have inflation between 2.8 and 4.5%. These are some results from a Japanese economist, Kowalski, that was published just in December of 2024. So we can see some really significant effects. Now, admittedly, I think that these models were on the high side, so I think we'd end up at the low side of those ranges, but these are still really big things. So I'm very concerned if one would move forward with this. The good news is I think Trump is open to some creative negotiating, and that's what I'm hoping might happen with China.
Professor John Gong, how do you look at the chart? Do you see it as something to celebrate? Do you think the trend, the trajectory would have been much better looking than what we're seeing now, had there not been the tariffs?
Well, I would have a more of a somber interpretation of this chart. I think one thing we can say is that the tariffs haven't been very effective in slowing down or scaling back Chinese exports to the United States. Chinese products are still very much competitive. The American people really still like products from China. As I said, the demand elasticity for these products are fairly low, meaning that even with higher prices, the demand hasn't been cut back very much. But on the other hand, I also would suggest that the long-term outlook of this chart, if you extend this chart further away to the right, I have as I said, a more of a somber interpretation of this. I think over the long run, the U.S.-China trade is not going to increase substantially. Maybe even decrease a little bit. I think the reason I'm saying this is because there's a wide consensus from left and right, from the current administration, from Democrats and from Republicans, that the United States shouldn't rely too much on China's imports, meaning that they're going to buy more things from other countries, whether from Chinese companies, other countries. That's an entirely different matter. But anyway, they're going to try to buy more things from other countries, and they're going to manufacture more domestically. So I think we shouldn't be very hopeful for the long-term prospect of Chinese exports to the United States. It's a process that's destined to happen, in my view. I think it's more importantly we should be thinking about how to manage this process more smoothly, less drastically, less disruptively, and of course less damagingly to both sides.
Professor Liang, what is your take? What do you see from these charts, from these numbers?
Right. Well, I think if the Trump team really studies numbers, they would actually be very happy, because when you look at the annual average growth rate, the U.S.'s imports from China grew at about 3% on average in the past 8 years. And when it comes to U.S. exports to China, that grew at an average rate of 9%. So what that means is that the U.S. is increasingly able to export their products to China. Now, I agree with Professor John Gong. When it comes to direct bilateral relationships, it could be a bit under sort of assault because of this idea of trade imbalances and whatnot. But at the same time, I think China now has increasingly import to a third country, the non-tariff countries like Malaysia, like Thailand, like Vietnam or Mexico. So I think in a way, the interdependence between the two countries are still there, and it's probably growing, as a matter of fact. But yes, the bilateral direct relationships maybe in some ways in disguise, and that means also trade as sometimes is being distorted. China has to first export to some third country, and then those third countries will manufacture and process further, and then export to the United States. But I think in a way, this kind of interdependence between the two countries, giving their complementarity of the economies, I think that relationship would go strong. Not to mention, when it comes to other business relationships, the U.S. companies wanted to be part of the Chinese markets. They also wanted to be being part of the China's technological ecosystem. So I think the two countries' economic relationships are very difficult to decouple and would not be beneficial for the two economies to do so.
Yeah, I have said something for a million times, but I think it is still necessary to mention. When you buy something from a shop, when you buy something from someone, you're not losing to this person or to this shop. You're not being taken advantage of this shop, right? But that seems to be the logic here. If you buy from China, you are losing out to China. Professor Fei. Yeah, Professor Fei, is there any way to tell people that trade deficit is not a crime, is not a sin?
Well, perhaps we can all try to learn something from President Trump. I should mention I'm not a Trump fan, despite being an American. I'm a Democrat. But I think Trump has shown us that he's a great communicator. And one of the ways that he's successful in communicating is by keeping messages simple. And one of the things that if I were, leading China, that I'd be working on is trying to get some simple messages clearly communicated to the American public and leadership. Because actually, the average American, when I'm in the U.S., has really mixed up understandings of China, is, in best case, 15 years back in time, does not appreciate many changes that China has made that the U.S. wants, like greater protection of IPR, like an appreciation that, yes, the trade deficit is still really large, but it has decreased substantially compared to what it used to be. So I think these messages are really important for China to try to drive home to the American people, and then to move forward to trying to see if one can do some things that, the U.S. and Trump would like. Because I do think that Trump is truly open to negotiating in non-traditional ways. And if one could work to try to get the trade balance more in place, if one could give U.S. companies a little more access to government procurement or to certain industries that are currently protected, even if there have been, in general, good progress in various areas like this, it's not understood by the American people.
Well, a lot of things. Well, I take your message, and I think you have a point. We're trying very hard to do a better job in making our story simple and relatable. all of these things you have said China has been doing. It's just that it's not felt, it's not understood, it's not explained, it's not known. But anyway, on the side of the deficit, for instance, it has happened. Trump wanted a smaller deficit in trade with China, and it has happened. Let's take a look at this chart. Now, the U.S. trade deficit with China in 2018 stood at about 420 billion US dollars, and by 2023 it came down to almost 280 billion US dollars. So that's about 1/3 less. Okay, Trump wanted that, Trump got that. Now, however, during the same period of time, the US trade deficit with the world in 2018, it was almost 900 billion US dollars. And in 2023, it went up to over $1 trillion, 1,000 billion. That went up by about 20%. So it's a whack-a-mole. Professor Gong, what happened? Why?
It's actually more of a nuanced picture than simply looking at the customs data. Now, I'll give you an example. I mean, I know it's difficult to convey the true economics behind it, but let me try this. For a simple iPhone, for example, exported for manufacturing in China, exported to the United States, it's recorded as a $400 or $500 U.S. trade deficit, right? But if you look at the value added created in both countries, it's not going to be $500 or $400, right? I mean, Qualcomm sells chips very expensively to China. It's money made to Qualcomm. The chips are made in Taiwan and designed in the United States. So in the trade economics, we have something called, you look at the deficit in value added. Meaning that comparing the value added in China versus value added in the United States through this trade transaction, the real value is way less than the $300 to $400 billion you're talking about here. I mean, that's the first thing I try to say. The second thing is that a lot of the trade deficit goes to American companies. They're operating in China, right? I mean, in other words, the money is actually not by the Chinese government or by the Chinese companies, by the Chinese workers. A lot of them actually made by American companies. They have this dollar deposited somewhere in a bank account in China. And eventually the money is going to be wired back to their headquarters, okay? Now, reportedly, 40% of China's exports to the United States, 40%, okay, above 40%, are actually associated with foreign companies. A lot of them actually American companies. So, that's another mitigating factor to say that the trade deficit is not that large. Now, the third thing I want to point out is that we're really talking about trade in goods only, right?
Yeah.
We haven't talked about trade in services yet.
Yeah.
At the trading service, China actually has a fairly large trade deficit.
Yeah.
American companies are, according to Trump's logic, they're actually making more money.
Right,
or
such
if
as
we're talking about stealing
universities,
money,
tourism, right.
stealing money from China.
Right.
So, and I'm just thinking about this, right? So the real trade balance picture in the United States, between the United States and China, is actually not that one side lopsided, as he's talking about, as he's describing. It's a little bit smaller than that.
Okay, Professor Liang, what is your take? The dichotomy between the trade deficit between China and the United States and the trade deficit between the United States and the world in general?
Well, first of all, I wanted to just echo what you just said, which is deficit is not the sign of weakness of an economy. It doesn't mean that you're being unfairly treated, right? Yes, you pay a store for buying things. That doesn't mean you're on the losing end. So I think that is very clear. But second, I agree with you. I think what this number shows is that deficit or not really depends on two things. One is the global financial system. Where the dollar is the global reserve system, all the countries want the US dollars. That means that would push up the dollar values, and that means countries will export more to the United States. And so that's one of the reasons that US has been consistently run the trade deficit for decades without seeing the currency collapse, without seeing the adjustments. There's a reason for that. And the second reason, again, is this trade deficit is a manifestation of the macroeconomic dynamics. So your saving, your investment, there is an imbalance internally, and that would translate into an external imbalance. So even if you're able to use tariff to reduce the direct trade deficit against China, you're not able to reduce your overall trade deficit with other countries. And so that goes back to what I said earlier in terms of the trade diversion. So instead of directly recording an import from China, now it shows an import from Vietnam. But again, a lot of these imports from Vietnam actually are used a lot of intermediate goods that are imported by Vietnam from China. So I think the bilateral trade deficit and surplus is a very misleading picture in some ways, and it doesn't really give you the nuance about trade. And I agree, Trump has a very simple narrative, and a lot of the, I think the voters, right, would really like to hear these simple stories. But this is a tactic for him to deflect some of the tensions of some of the policy incompetence within the domestic market for creating good pay and good jobs for the people.
Well, it looks like we're going to experience another 4 years of whatever is going to happen during his presidency. Now, anyway, let's focus on what's going to happen in the next period, in the near future. Trump have emphasized fair trade as he did during his first term. On day one of his return to office, he said he signed the America First Trade Policy Memorandum, which states that the U.S. Trade Representative shall undertake a review of and identify any unfair trade practices by other countries and recommend appropriate actions to remedy such practices under applicable authorities. Meanwhile, however, Chinese Vice Premier Ding Xuexiang said at the World Economic Forum in Davos that in terms of foreign trade, China doesn't seek trade surplus. We want to import more competitive quality products and services to promote balanced trade. So China talks about balanced trade and President Trump talks about fair trade. Professor Fei, are they the same thing? How far apart are we? Is there a possibility of finding some kind of common ground, middle point?
Well, I think that there are some possibilities. The good news, as I've said, is that Trump really is open to creative negotiation. And what I think will probably happen is, unfortunately, I think we probably will see some additional tariffs at least be threatened or maybe even come in place on the U.S. side. But I hope that that will be a beginning point for discussion, and I think it will be. And I think that China is sincere in saying that, we're not trying to grow the trade deficit that the U.S. has. In fact, we'd like to have it more in balance. And so hopefully China will be open to more ways to have that happen. China has taken some significant stances and steps to try to have that happen, such as, the China International Import Expo and other things like this. I think if the American people understood all the things that the Chinese government was doing, this would be appreciated, and I think hopefully China will be open to doing even more things, and that one can meet some common ground. Personal relationships are critical for Trump, and I think there hopefully can be a good personal relationship between Trump and Xi moving forward.
Well, we hope for that. Professor Liang, let me interrupt. Let me bring you in here because you mentioned something really interesting. You said China imported an annual increase of 9% from the United States. Do you have more on that for us? Can you elaborate a little bit more? What is China buying, or who are buying from China, from the, American products? What more can you tell us about it?
Well, I mean, China does purchase, quite a bit of farm goods. China is the largest soybean, buyers, foreign buyers from the United States. China also import, energy from the United States. So farm and energy products reach about $35 billion a year. And then, of course, a lot of these semiconductor chips and others, right? Tech goods. So I think that's the tricky part, as you just mentioned, in terms of balanced trade and fair trade. In some ways, yes, both countries wanted to have more sort of balanced trade accounts. But the difficulty right now, I think, is the U.S.'s restriction on China's imports of the U.S. chips. And we know that China imports, over $350 billion chips every year. It's the largest imports, even more than oil and gas. But if the U.S. is restricting now these chips, not only the cutting edge, the high-end chips, but now more of the even legacy chips, and I think that would really, in a way, cripple the U.S.'s export prospects to China. So I think this is really the dilemma. Trump wants to use tariff as the tool to make China make compromise and buy more products from the United States, and yet at the same time restrict some of the most important, I think, U.S. exports to China that China desires. And on the other hand, I think China is saying they wanted to buy more consumer goods because when we look at the numbers, China imports about $2.59 trillion of products from the rest of the world just last year. And you compare that, to when China joined WTO, this is more than 10 times increase. So China does have the interest, with 400 million strong middle income households, China do want to buy more from the rest of the world. And China does want to use dialogue and cooperation to solve these difficult, trade issues. But at the same time, I think we really need to see if the U.S. can really deploy, sensible policies to encourage the trade issue to be resolved.
Yeah. Professor Gong, we're talking about trade as if China is one big person who's just buying or selling. We're talking about millions of people. We're talking about 1.4 billion people. We're talking about countless number of companies who make decisions, right? Sovereign decisions about where to buy, where to sell. So how can someone, just say, okay, you're going to buy this much from me, otherwise I'm going to punish you? Yeah, for me, it doesn't make sense.
You're absolutely right. It's not. It doesn't work like that. I think on the trade side, we are facing essentially a regulatory shock from Washington. It's going to deal a huge blow to the international trade system. I think China's mostly affected. We are accounting for about 30% of the world's manufacturing capacity. So, with the largest market in the world, essentially establishing walls and warding off imports, it's going to have a huge impact, the largest of which probably is going to fall on China. But in addition to trade, I have been advocating Chinese companies go to the United States for indirect investment for quite some time. But the problem is that the current political environment, the current even including a public reception of Chinese investment has been very hospitable to Chinese investments. I think this is actually a very good way of addressing the trade imbalance here between the United States and China. Chinese companies go to the United States, establish there, do manufacturing there, create jobs there. You can build competitive products using American labor in some very good markets, in my view, like Southeast United States, Southwestern United States. The labor cost isn't that high. The regulatory cost is low. Utility, water, land cost, transportation is great. I mean, all these are very good investment factors. But unfortunately, it's the political investment environment that is killing these potential deals. So I think this is a dilemma that is very difficult to solve. I'm not very optimistic about addressing this long-term problem here. I think decoupling between China and the United States it's underway to some extent, and it's very difficult to reverse this trend. I think the hope is to prolong this process, as I said, to make this process more smooth, less disruptive, and hopefully not damaging to both countries.
Well, I can only add that I was in a BYD factory in Southern California where American workers were building electric buses, electric cars, and it was a beautiful sight to see American workers putting their talent and hard work into this product that's good for them and good for China and good for the planet in general. So why not more of such projects in the future? What's the problem? Anyway, we'll keep a close watch on the situation and do what we can to promote that kind of cooperation. Many thanks to my guests, Zhang Gong, Liang Yan, and Carl Fei. Once again, happy Chinese New Year of the Snake, and I hope to have much more interesting discussion coming up in the new year. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Happy New Year.
Thank you.
Happy New Year. And with that, we come to the end of this special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin, coming to you from Beijing. As usual, you can follow me on Facebook and X using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing on behalf of the whole team. Thank you for watching. You've got The Point. And once again, Happy New Year of the Snake.